Adam, are we starting? Okay. All right, Dick, put up the phone. So, welcome to the 23rd Annual CVMBS Research Day. Just as a point, this year we have a record number of presentations, 130 presentations today, representing all 4 of our departments. Before I go any further, good heavens. Do we have to do that? I did want to recognize some folks who have worked so hard to pull this program together today, and maybe y'all could stand up as I announce your names. So, Teresa Rulon, and Amy Oak. Amy, are you here? She may be up on the 3rd floor. And then faculty members that have been instrumental in pulling this off. First of all, Kelly Santangelo, I think, is here. Hi, Kelly. Adam Chico, of course. And John Kissaday. Thank you all for all you've done to pull this together. So I mentioned this to Adam. Well, a couple of things. It's been an odd morning. So I was telling Kelly and Adam that first thing today, I was over in the office in AZ and walked over to the Hilton for this event, and then got over there and thought, well, this is awfully quiet. I adjusted and got back here. But I pointed this out to Adam that the talking points that you sent me at the top, which is great, thank you. It reads right up here at the top, 23rd Annual CVMBS Research Day, January 22nd, 2020. Now, I don't know if that was Freudian, but so the day is correct, but it is an interesting slip. I remember that day actually quite well as our dean, Mark Stetter, couldn't make it, and I opened the program with probably most of the audience wondering, who the hell is that guy? And I recall that I started by channeling Admiral Stockdale by asking, who am I and why am I here? Well, probably fair questions again. Once again, our dean couldn't make it, so here I am, and it's an honor. I also recall that day Dr. Santangelo was our Zoetis awardee and gave the keynote address that day. So this fall and winter has certainly been a lot of firsts and lasts, and today is certainly one of those. This will be my first time to be able to preside over the opening of this program as dean, albeit interim, and quite likely my last, as I suspect that essentially everybody in this audience is hoping that we have a new dean standing up here in January 2023. So January 22nd, 2020, I just had to think about that a little bit, and there's a little segment in the newspaper called Today in History. I'm moving your thing, Angela, so it doesn't drop dead, you bet. In the newspaper called Today in History, and I look at that because it's weird, I guess. Anyway, one of these, January 22nd, 2020, Chinese health authorities urged people in the city of Wuhan to avoid crowds and public gatherings after warning about a new viral illness. And I recall about a month later, I had study section in Seattle, last time I was at a study section in person. And at the same hotel, actually, was a special emphasis panel of NIAID. And one of the members of that ad hoc panel was actually a faculty member on our own MIP department. So I crossed paths with that person at the Seattle airport, SeaTac, and we were on the same flight back to Denver, sitting there in the waiting area, and I was reading the Seattle newspaper, and there was a front page article about an outbreak of coronavirus in an assisted living facility in Redmond, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And sort of casually, I asked this faculty member, I'm not going to say who it is, because there was language used that you wouldn't normally attribute to this particular faculty member. And so I sort of casually asked, how bad do you think this is going to be? And this person was quiet for about 10 or 15 seconds. And I was kind of looking over, and finally they said, pretty effing bad. Although effing isn't exactly the terminology they used, sort of like an oracle. So within a month, certainly the world we knew changed forever, and certainly some of the darkest days I think any of us have witnessed were on us. Everything changed: teaching, research, service. Now over 800,000 deaths attributed to COVID-19 in the U.S. coupled over this past 2 years with devastating fires, Cameron Peak Fire, more recently Marshall Fire, so colleagues, friends, family that have lost homes. Everything we do changed, forums, meetings, conferences through a computer screen. I've never seen so many colleagues in sweatshirts, baseball caps, 3 days growth of beard, pets, children. So how we interacted with each other, albeit, 3 dimensions, but in a 2-dimensional screen was certainly fundamentally altered. I got to say the reduced formality wasn't necessarily all bad. I actually have a picture as a conference, a dean's conference in the summer of 2020. I was in the office, and it was obviously through Zoom, and it was what we would typically think of as a relatively formal conference. So I was in my office, and Mark Stetter was in his office, and I was dressed like this. I had like I often do, just a button shirt and a sport coat. He poked his head in just to say hi, had his mask on, and opened the door, and then he snapped a picture. And so I was dressed like this from the waist up, and from the waist down, it was shorts and flip-flops, and he was like, so someday I'll have to unbury that picture. And So despite all this, here we are today. It's a beautiful January day in Colorado, record number of research presentations. So I guess my message today, let's not forget all the losses, the pain and suffering that we've seen over the last couple of years, but also really celebrate our achievements since January 22nd, 2020. And I've said this many times, all that's because of you, not me, not college leadership, not university leadership, but all of you who delivered the mission every single day, not only delivered, but innovated, created, and led by force of character and commitment to who we are and what we are. So reality is that you are the leadership that has brought us together today, and once again to celebrate in person our scholarship. So thanks to all of you. Give yourselves a hand. Now, just a couple of additional thanks and some housekeeping. First of all, our industry sponsors, so including Boehringer Ingelheim, Zoetis, of course, CSU Infectious Disease Research Center, and CSU Ventures. Also remind you that after the keynote address, there will be 4 concurrent oral presentation sessions upstairs on the 3rd floor along the southeast corridor, and poster sessions starting from noon and going to 4 o'clock this afternoon. So at 4 o'clock, if you can, please stay and participate in the awards ceremony. And our top presenters in multiple categories will be honored. We'll also present the Golden Pipette Award, much coveted award to the department that has, by some arcane algorithm that only Adam and Mark know, will be identified. I don't believe we actually have vendor tables here today, but if we do, maybe a couple. Graduate Women in Science in Northern Colorado chapter, I believe, and I think CSU Ventures also has a sponsored table. So please stop by and visit with them. So next, I'd like to call on our Research Associate Dean and Acting Executive Associate Dean. Thank you for doing that, Mark. I have to say that every single day. To present the Zoetis Award for Veterinary Research Excellence and to introduce our keynote speaker for today. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Colin. So nice to see you all. This is great. This is great. Almost back to normal, right? I can't wait to see all of your faces soon. It's really my pleasure to present the Zoetis Award today. The purpose of this award is to foster innovative research in veterinary research and scientific advancement of the veterinary profession. Zoetis does this by recognizing the outstanding research effort and productivity of principal investigators whose research conducted over the past 3 years has attained or likely to attain international recognition. And our speaker today, Dr. Angela Bosco-Lauth, certainly fits that bill. Most of you have probably read the source article, very nice source article about Dr. Bosco-Lauth. But also you may have seen the New York Times article where she was consulted as an expert in SARS-CoV-2. And more recently, on 9 News, if you saw the serosurveillance efforts for West Nile virus by monitoring residential chickens and their eggs, which really innovative thinking outside the box, which kind of exemplifies Angela's work. Angela is truly a homegrown scientist in our college. She received her BS in microbiology and PhD in microbiology here, then went on to earn her DVM degree and a postdoc in BMS, where she is now currently a tenure track assistant professor with a joint appointment in MIT. I told Greg I would mention that. As a microbiologist and zoonotic infectious disease specialist, Angela has been very busy over the past 3 years, and particularly over the past 2 years in COVID. She has published nearly 30 articles in the last 3 years, which is outstanding. Many of them high impact and in collaboration with others in this audience, a couple of really nice PNAS papers. As well as a great, she's obviously has such broad research interests. This serosurveillance idea, she's expanding and has a really nice paper out right now looking at serosurveillance for anthrax by looking at swine. So both West Nile and anthrax using serosurveillance for seroconversion in vector animals. Just really innovative stuff. She has been PI or co-PI on over 20 extramurally funded research projects since 2019, totaling over $4 million in support, and additionally expanding that collaboration with Dr. Vanderwood and received a NSF grant for $2.5 million or $12.5 million to study how the airborne microbes impact animal and human health. Our good friend and colleague, Dr. Bob Honda, in one of his last acts as interim department head, and while really battling cancer at the last stages, wrote just a beautiful letter of support for Angela. And the last time I spoke with Bob, we talked about that letter and his nomination, and we both remarked about Angela's skill set and how she truly is a triple threat, right? We're talking about her research today, which is fabulous, but she's also a fantastic DVM and service as a veterinarian, and also a fabulous mentor and teacher. So it's a well-earned reward. Man, my phone keeps closing on me. She presently mentors 4 graduate students, contributes to teaching both in the undergraduate and DVM space, and serves as attending veterinarian for the Animal Reproduction and Biotechnology Labs, and also has an affiliation with the National Wildlife Research Center. So I'm not sure what she's going to talk about today. She could talk about a lot of things, but the title of, oh God, yeah, the title of her talk is Shaping the World One Pandemic at a Time. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Angela Bosco-Lauth.
Thanks so much, Mark.
And now we need the paparazzi, so if
I
you
know,
have...
paparazzi. There's a lot of cameras, I'll probably lose my mind.
We step over here so we can
Awesome.
see it.
Paparazzi of iPhones. I love it. Do you want your phone?
Thank you.
All right, so it's an honor and a privilege to be here today. And since I'm talking about pandemics, I'm actually just going to leave my mask on since it's kind of fitting for the way we're talking about the world today. But it's so fun to be here in person, and I really appreciate the turnout and the support that this college, this university has for research and science. And the fact that we can still do a research day in the midst of an Omicron, brand new outbreak, it feels like, is really quite amazing. So I'm going to admit that I had a hard time trying to decide what to talk about today, and hopefully you guys can still hear me if I step away. Is that getting too quiet? Too quiet. Okay, I'll stay over here. I thought at first, knee-jerk reaction, I'm a researcher, let me talk about some of my research. And then I started reading through some of the abstracts, the presentations you're all going to hear today, and I thought, man, what you're going to hear today is way more exciting than anything I have to talk about. So instead, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some historical things that have changed the world, one pandemic at a time. And so I wanted to go back a little bit to my roots about what kind of brought me here. And I had to put an embarrassing picture of myself up there. So anybody else do a senior picture with your horse? Yeah. I was that nerd in school. It's never really changed, but you know, this was kind of my introduction to school. I wanted to be a veterinarian. More than anything in the world, that was my goal. If anybody knew Dr. Ken Blem, he was my advisor when I came to CSU in 2002, and he said all I ever said was vet, 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 vet. I think the words annoying were some things that he used later to describe me, and I just wouldn't let it go. So anyways, I wanted to be a horse vet. That was everything to me. And of course, who knows what disease this is? West Nile virus, yeah. So you look at that timeline, and 2002 is when I came to CSU wanting to be a horse vet, and 2003 is when I acquired my newest horse, who is featured in some very famous news articles now apparently. So this was a big concern. And up until that point, all I wanted to do was practice medicine and help horses one horse at a time. And all of a sudden, it became much more obvious to me that maybe there's a slightly different calling for me. This was a disease that I found so interesting because it wasn't in my background to really study infectious disease. I was really into science, but only as it applied to how I would get from one goal to the next. And this was my first introduction to a disease that was really impacting us locally, as well as really internationally, if you start thinking about it now, but at the time, all across the country. And I was a horse person still, that's never going to change, but equine West Nile virus, especially here in Fort Collins, was really a big deal right about 2003. I believe CSU probably saw the abundance of cases that maybe any school in the US saw, and this was a devastating disease for horses. Those that did survive, and most of them, honestly, that were infected did actually survive, much like with people, but those that didn't have a good prognosis, it was usually fatal for them. And so right away, I started thinking, I have this new horse that I'm really scared is going to get this disease. What can I do about it? Is there a vaccine? What can we do to prevent it? And so I was lucky enough at that point to meet Dr. Dick Bowen, and that kind of changed my whole world. At the time, he was working on some of the most innovative vaccine research and really supporting almost all the, stop me if I'm wrong, Dick, but I think almost all the equine vaccine trials probably for all the big companies in the country. And I was able to join his lab as an undergraduate researcher, really just kind of on a whim and through some very fortuitous introductions, and started to see this research firsthand about what it looks like to not just save one horse at a time, but potentially thousands. And that completely changed how I thought about what I wanted to do with my life and how I thought about research. I think research was a totally black box for me before that. I didn't really know what it meant and didn't have anything to do with medicine, I didn't think. So instead of going into vet school right away, I decided to pursue a career in research and did my graduate work first. And really it was West Nile that launched all of that. And I think I'm kind of proud to show this graph because I think a lot of the work that's led to this epidemic curve for West Nile changing the way it has came out of CSU and largely out of some of Dick Bowen's research. So this is somewhat of a success story, in my opinion, to go from a caseload of 15,000 equine cases of West Nile down to just, in the low numbers, under 100 a year is pretty amazing. And that's all due to veterinarians, public health people, researchers coming together and kind of solving the world's problems, right? And so that kind of launched my career into looking at other aspects of both West Nile and other zoonotic diseases. Got to work with some of the coolest animals ever, including alligators and all variety of birds. Got really invested in mosquito-borne and vector-borne disease research, and that drove the next 8 years of my life. And largely, I think, at least for West Nile virus, we've got some success that we can talk about. Majority of horses in the US and largely across the world are vaccinated, so we see very few cases now. Some of the bird species that had been horribly impacted have actually rebounded. Some of that is due to conservation work and vaccination of key species. Some of that's just due to natural population regrowth. And we have a significantly better understanding of the virus and the hosts and the disease itself. And a lot of that's due to research that was done here at CSU, across the street at the Centers for Disease Control, along with a huge majority of other universities at the time. So for me, that was the first epidemic. It wasn't truly considered a pandemic, but that was the disease that to me, made the first really big impact on my life. But unfortunately, I think it's a success story in some ways and then not in others. So in terms of where we are with people, last year was actually a record year for human West Nile cases. It was one of our highest caseloads for humans since the epidemic started in the US. And that kind of made me step back and think a little bit about, okay, veterinarians have a huge role in how research goes and in how public health is influenced, but we can probably do better. And what's the historical precedent for diseases? So really, when you think about history of the world, maybe you didn't learn this in high school, or maybe you didn't learn this even in college, but so much of history has been changed really by pandemics, by disease, by epidemics. And so that got me to thinking about, okay, so we're living through something that's going to impact us for the rest of our lives, I'm sure. But this isn't unprecedented. Certainly this is something that's happened time and time again. And for those of you who know me, I love history. I think if I had made a different path in my life, I would definitely be a historian, which may have been a safer career in some ways, but also maybe not quite as exciting. So I wanted to step back and kind of talk through some of the diseases that have changed the world. This is certainly not all of them, but just a few that have made the biggest impact on society as a whole. So of course we all know what the plague is, right? This is a bacterial pathogen that has largely probably killed more people than any other pathogen on the planet. And this is an ancient disease. This is a disease that started probably prior to even the 165 to 180 AD. But certainly that was the first recognized major epidemic, or pandemic in this case, where nations across mostly Europe, Eurasia, parts of Africa were affected. The Justinian plague was another large epidemic, but I think the one that we're all really most familiar with is the Black Death. And I think this is a thing that we need to still keep in mind, even as we go through COVID, even as we go through other pandemics, is that I don't think anything will ever match the Black Death when it comes to amount of people who are impacted and the way the world completely changed how it functioned. So a third to half of Europe's population was wiped out over the course of less than 10 years, and that completely changed the face of the world. And it didn't stop there. Plague went on to take out a large portion of London's population in the 1660s. And then really there was a pandemic that lasted almost 100 years throughout much of Indochina, as most recently as the 1950s. And I think largely what we've learned from the plague is that chaos is inevitable when it comes to disease. This changed how people lived their lives in Europe and parts of India and Asia. And it really started to make people think more and more about science and progress. And not that that was an easy process, but really, look at that mask. I really wanted to find a plague mask for today, but they're just so creepy, I probably couldn't have done it even if I wanted to. But that might be some of our first PPE. And as weird as they look, that was meant to kind of protect the air passages. So already they were starting to realize, this is back in the 1500s, that maybe there was something about the bad air. And then they would pack those masks full of potpourri and other herbs to try to help ward off what at the time was considered more of a bad spirit. And this was really interesting because it really did start this new process of thinking. And so at the time, prior to learning some of these new techniques, what was one of the major ways that we got rid of an infectious disease? It was things like bloodletting, which I think we look at that today and go, why on earth would draining your blood ever make you feel better, right? But it was a major way that that was treated. And so what started happening during the plague is that physicians largely were dying off as fast as their clients were, or as fast as the people they were treating were. And so the people that were coming up were having to learn to adapt and be more practical, and hence things like the masks. And all of a sudden the physicians didn't want to touch their patients, so they would use sticks to assess them, which led to less bloodletting on the bright side, but probably not great medicine, right? So it profoundly changed history. And there's a book, actually, I believe it's called Black Death and the Silver Lining. Has not been super well received because it's hard to find a silver lining in up to 200 million deaths. But there are some things that change for the better. And one of those is improved medicine. And that's certainly something that we see continuing today. Every time a new disease starts, we see improvements in medicine. But thinking about the way it changed the feudal system in Europe, that's actually had a tremendous impact on the rest of the way that continent grew. It made it so that people who were, it was kind of an equalizer. People who were super rich died just as easily as those who were super poor, and it offset that balance. So you no longer had the richest of the rich basically ruling over, lording over all the poor people and making their lives miserable. All of a sudden, you needed those poor people to work, or there was no food. So it really did change the balance of how the feudal system worked in Europe. Underpopulation automatically leads to more improved rights for women. Women have to join the workforce. Now, of course, we've got hundreds of years of that going back and forth, right? But it is one of the places where you start to see women coming into the forefront, is when there's a war or a major disease. And of course, for those who are art lovers, this really launched the Renaissance movement. And so for some people, that's a pretty big benefit. So shifting from plague to look at another disease that's also quite ancient and has changed the way mankind has lived and existed, is smallpox. This is a disease that I think has been the biggest success story of science, at least of modern science, and that it's been eradicated, thank goodness. But I think we sometimes forget that smallpox was a major killer. It was endemic throughout much of the world, and in the old world was always responsible for a large percentage of deaths due to infectious disease. But the colonization of America and the Central America, all the Americas, the entire New World, would have been very different had it not been for smallpox. Estimates are 90% of indigenous people were probably wiped out by smallpox, and maybe some other diseases as well, but that's the predominant one. And just thinking about the last century, upwards of 300 to 500 million people were still dying of a disease that now we don't even think about. Who here is vaccinated for smallpox? See, more because you all work in infectious disease, right? But when you ask a lot of people, they don't know what that even means. So if you were born in the late 70s and on, it's not a thing we do anymore. We just take it for granted that we're not going to die of smallpox. And this is what it can look like. So a horribly disfiguring disease for those who survived, but many, many people didn't make it that far. It's possible that smallpox is part of a disease called Kokolitsli, which is actually a collection of diseases that now is thought to be potentially measles, potentially smallpox, maybe Salmonella paratyphi, but again, largely changed how the New World was colonized. Most of the Aztecs actually died of this Kokolitsli disease, which again is a combination of different pathogens. But it also led to some amazing technology. Variolation was the first pseudo form of vaccination that involved taking actual smallpox pustules and inoculating them into healthy people at the time. Thomas Jefferson actually did this to his daughters, and they almost died, but were able to survive, and then in later times able to help treat other people. But in 1796, this became Edward Jenner's, the father of vaccinology. This was the disease that drove that. And I think I'm speaking to a crowd who largely knows that, a bunch of disease people out here and scientists. But really, this is the onset of an era of technology that changes the way diseases and the world thinks about disease. For the first time ever, we're not treating disease, we're preventing it. And using a technique that seemed radical at the time, but I'm not sure that vaccine clinic looks all that different from some of the trucks we've seen outside with vaccines for COVID, right? So change the way the world thinks about technology and change the way the world thinks about science. Jenner got laughed off the stage many, many times. A lot of people did not believe in his techniques initially, as is the case for all scientists who have a really great idea that is a bit counter to the norm. But largely what he did for the world is something that can't be left without talking about it even today. So a bit more modernly, we have to talk about influenza when it comes to pandemics that have changed our world as well. The Russian flu is really the first giant outbreak of influenza, and I think the Spanish flu is the one that most people are right now most closely associating with how the COVID pandemic is looking today. Spanish flu is a misnomer that was largely given that name because Spain was neutral during the war, and so we really don't know if it started in Spain or someplace else in Europe, but the Spanish flu killed between 50 to 100 plus million people in the course of 2 years. What's interesting about the Spanish flu is that in typical diseases, you often have the very, very young and the very, very old that are the most heavily impacted, but during the 1918 pandemic, it was actually people in their 20s to 40s. Part of that was certainly World War I and the spread of the people who were actually transmitting this pathogen were in that age group. But there's also other factors, just virulence in general, that we can't really explain even today why this was such a bad one, but it really was. And it's something that opened people's eyes to how dangerous and deadly these pathogens can be, even in a more modern era. And certainly it's not like it's over. This is one of the diseases that we have to worry about constantly. And I mean, I think in early 2020, we were all thinking, oh my goodness, is COVID gonna be as bad as the flu? Because we know how bad the flu can be. And this is just an image of a hospital setting. This, I believe, is in a fort in Kansas right after World War I. And I don't think this looks all that different from the hospital settings we're seeing today. So again, medicine keeps changing and improving, but it doesn't mean we're necessarily making great progress in fighting off these diseases. But some of the good things that have come of flu was really the onset of socialized medicine in many places in the world, because this was a disease that, once again, wasn't impacting just the poor or just the old. People became much more engaged in how to actively prevent it and how to actively treat it. The importance of epidemiology became much more prominent during the pandemic of 1918. And of course, today we see that flu has huge impacts on agriculture. Even if these are non-human pathogenic flus, we're having a bit of an outbreak right now with a highly pathogenic avian flu. So things that we will have to constantly keep working on and worrying about probably for the rest of our lives. But I love this. This is an image I found from a news article from 1918. And I'll just read a couple of these. To prevent influenza, do not take any person's breath. Not sure exactly what that means, but I think the gist is clear. Keep the mouth and teeth clean. It's dental hygiene, very, very important. Avoid those that cough and sneeze. Yep, so we're starting to get some ideas here that I think are similar now and then. Don't visit poorly ventilated places. So that's maybe the first time we've talked about actual location as being a place that you can get sick. Avoid common drinking cups, always a good idea. Cover your mouth when you cough and sneeze, great idea. And then I love this last one. In sick rooms, wear a gauze mask. So not very different than what we're doing right now, right? They didn't say social distancing, that's a new term, but I think largely it was implied. And of course, these are techniques that we still use for every respiratory virus today. So I would be remiss if I didn't bring up one disease that isn't necessarily spread by airborne, but I think this is the disease that for many of us in the room was probably our first introduction to a pandemic. Was anybody here alive in 1918? I don't think so. So I think I'm safe to say this was our first real global pandemic for most of the generation here. And HIV/AIDS was totally different in the sense that this is a disease that impacted very select groups of people. It's a disease of the poor. It's a disease of the LGBTQ community. This is a disease of people who, in many, many ways, initially had it coming, right? So that's a terrifying thought. And AIDS has killed 35 million people to date. And there are still 37 million people infected with AIDS today, largely people who live in Africa. So again, a disease of the underprivileged, a disease of people who don't have a good way to protect themselves. But one thing that I think has been tremendous about the AIDS pandemic is that not only did it have a lot of impact socially, but it really started to show the community that we really need to be much more focused on research and not hysteria. And I love that image because I think it's so true, and I think we've all embraced that here, that in the face of catastrophic life-changing diseases and pandemics, the knee-jerk reaction is to be afraid. And yet, in reality, what we should be doing is getting focused. And I'm preaching to the choir when I talk to a bunch of scientists. But the rest of the world still needs to see this impact. So HIV is obviously an ongoing problem. The stigma and the social injustice that has taken place across the world due to this disease is unprecedented in some ways. But we've also made some incredible advancements in antiviral therapies. There are now pills that you can take to prevent AIDS altogether, even with an exposure. And there are people who have been living with this disease now for decades and have a healthy, comfortable life because of technology and science. And so I couldn't finish out without a little bit of COVID talk, and I promise I won't talk about research, but this is, of course, happening in near time. And so we've learned a few things. Toilet paper is clearly the best preventative against COVID-19. And I think it's still happening today because I was in the store the other day and there's no toilet paper again. So I don't know where it all went, but we're gonna have to come up with a new way to, wipe ourselves at some point pretty soon, so. But largely, the global impact of SARS-CoV-2 can't be understated, but we don't really know the long term. We don't know what's going to happen. Certainly, it's changed how we think about work. I mean, how many people now can work from home and still do a completely successful day's work? Some of us not as much, but certainly a lot of people can, right? Virtual choir concerts, virtual performances, virtual everything. I mean, it's changed how we can interact. I kind of love that we can now have a conversation with our international partners almost any time. You know, sometimes it's 2 a.m. for them or us, but at least we can have this conversation and look somebody in the face. But on the downside, we're still seeing this incredible amount of backlash. And a lot of that is just due to lack of understanding and lack of real knowledge. And I think what's so scary to me is that this has been a thing that's happened forever. Early in the Black Death, flagellants, people who would whip themselves because they believed if they punished themselves that they would ward off the bad spirits that God had sent to punish them with this plague. Now we have fake news, we have theories that Bill Gates is injecting microchips into us, which I hate to say it, but if you've got a cell phone, you don't need a microchip. Let's be honest about that. So is history going to just keep repeating itself? Are we going to keep having to worry about every time there's a pandemic, no matter how much we fight it? Are we always going to have to deal with the backlash of society? Some of the technologies and advances that have happened thanks to COVID and other diseases are unparalleled. We can now detect within a day a brand new variant, and within a couple of weeks show that that new variant is infecting most people. And to me, that's fascinating and amazing, and that's all science. That's all science that's changed the world in the last 20 years with PCR and other technologies. Certainly our antivirals and our vaccine technology is unparalleled in history. I think I'm still a little bit amazed that we were able to get a vaccine marketable and out to millions and millions and millions of people in less than 2 years of a pandemic's existence. So to me, that's a success story that I think we don't talk about enough. And probably because it's not helping as much as we hoped it would, but it's still amazing, and we have to kind of keep thinking about that. But where do we go from here? And what's next? And how do we start combating COVID-19? And what's the next thing that's coming up? Famous people, famous microbiologists throughout time have always faced backlash. Even Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister here in the center, some of his techniques saved millions of soldiers ultimately, but largely these people were at the top of their game and very well respected by their peers, but people didn't believe their science or their research initially until many years later in some cases. But these are the forefathers of microbiology who have basically led to all the advancements that we know today. But what I think is really exciting is that the next generation, first of all, no offense to anybody here, it's not going to be just a bunch of old white men, right? We've got a whole generation of people now who are of all different walks and types of life, men, women, gender neutral, you name it. We have a whole new generation of people who are coming into the forefront and who are respected, and who are respected by their peers and are respected by at least half of society, and that's an improvement that we can take some privilege and knowledge that knowing that we're doing that one step at a time in the face of a pandemic. And so I'm just going to leave you guys with a kind of a call to action. I think it's appropriate today that we're listening to largely a bunch of young people talk about some of the most groundbreaking and exciting research at this university, and probably internationally. So let's be honest, CSU has an amazing international research program, and we're very well renowned in what we do. And it's not just infectious disease. Look at our vet school, my goodness, hasn't been the top of its game for how many years, I don't even know, but we do amazing work here. The problem is we still haven't done an amazing job of telling everybody else what we do. And this is a call to action for all scientists and for all people who support science, is that we really need to figure out how to prevent that fake news from becoming the thing that's at the forefront. We like to sit in our ivory towers and write our very technical papers, and I mean, those of you who have tried to share your articles with your parents, they go, that's so cool. I have no idea what you're talking about. You know, let's be honest. And I mean, some of your parents, maybe you're a scientist too, and they get it. But largely, we haven't figured out a really good way to communicate what we do so that it seems real and tangible and like we're not just making it up, right? So my call to everybody today is to go out and really present your research as much as you possibly can. Talk about it in front of your peers. make sure people understand that what we do is really for the betterment of society. Who here is getting rich because of their science? Yeah, so when you hear that, it's conspiracy theory. I mean, I would love to say I'm making $1 million a year because of all the great work I'm doing, but most of us are still paying off many, many years of student loans. So science is not for the benefit of individuals, it's for the benefit of the whole. So make that point. And I think pandemics are going to be part of our future probably forever. But with any amount of luck, with the message that this next generation of amazing scientists can bring to the table is a better message and a more active and vocal message to make sure people understand what it is that we do and why it's so necessary. With that, I'd really like to thank Dr. Bob Honda, who was instrumental in helping my career and also just a wonderful man and an advocate for science everywhere. Can't speak enough kindness about what a great man Bob really was. And thank you to everybody who let me be here today, especially to Dr. Bowen, who I know hates being acknowledged, but I love to do it anyways, and to my wonderful family. And so with that, thank you guys so much for listening to me, and any questions you might have, happy to take them. I also have no idea how long I went, so if we're over time, you just let me know. Excellent. Cool. I purposely didn't present anything that would have questions. That was by design. Yeah, Mark.
I can't let you escape without saying something, because I forgot to say something during your introduction, and that is, I talked about you as a triple threat, but I meant to say specifically that you are a fantastic role model for the next generation. I love that picture of that girl with the goggles on. So I'm not sure I have a question, but do you want to just speak for a second about how you feel your role is as a scientist and a woman in science to that next generation?
Yeah. First of all, it's a little bit weird still to be talking about me talking to the next generation, because I'm not that old, but no, I'm definitely getting there. I guess what I see my role as being is really to help uplift and encourage, especially the youngest generation, and men and women and people of color, and anybody who's ever felt like their voice hasn't been heard in science. I would like you to have a bigger voice, and if there's anything that I can do to make that voice more heard and to help you along the way, I think now is the time to be as encouraging as we can, and to make sure that we also are encouraged to speak out, and not just within our own social groups and within our own little realm of scientists. I think getting the word out there to the larger world is so important, and really, it's this generation, and here I am going to date myself a little bit because I'm terrible with social media, so all of you who understand how to use Twitter and whatever other things are out there, Facebook, it's not the most important one now, but whatever it is, use your social media platforms as a way to promote your science and as a way to promote truth. So that's how I hope to be able to help the next generation, is to really give you your voice, and anything I do to make that better, that's my goal in life. Yeah, I think that's Todd. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see.
Can you explain why natural infection is not considered a booster or a vaccine?
You mean by with natural infection with COVID? Yeah, so I think natural infection largely is considered somewhat of a protective mechanism, but I think what we're seeing over and over again is that the more immunity you can build, the better. And I saw a CDC report, I think yesterday, that shows that people who have been vaccinated and infected had the best immunity against SARS-CoV-2, but many people who have just been infected, it's much like receiving a single shot. They don't necessarily have lasting immunity. I know at least personally 4 people who have been infected multiple times, and some of whom get quite sick every time. So I think it's that combination of the more immunity you can build, both with vaccines and with natural infection, which is probably inevitable at this point. That's really, I think, the way we're going to get out of this. Anybody else? Adam.
Angela, so what's your perspective on what is really limiting the public's acceptance of behaviors that are healthiest for preventing the pandemic from getting worse? And obviously it's a lot of things. Is it distrust of science, fear maybe, at its root, I don't really want to admit to myself this is a real thing, or just plain old ignorance, they don't understand what the means. From your perspective, what is the biggest limitation to the public
Yeah, it's such a good question, and at the risk of getting political, which I won't, I do think a lot of it is mistrust, and I think it's mistrust because of the misinformation and not knowing how to find the correct information. It's out there, but there's so much other info that's also out there that I don't think people know where to look. And I believe most people probably get their information from their social media sources, and that's largely the most unvetted, imaginable way to get your information. So to me, it's all about that sort of thing. And then I certainly think we have other aspects. I think there's a fear. Certainly it's not helping that we have all these breakthrough infections that leads to people not trusting in the vaccine technology. But even when you have proof that the more immunity you have, the better off you do, it's still, there's this fear factor. And then constant misinformation by a variety of different sources on every political end of the spectrum. So again, it's the scientists who need to speak out loudly and clearly and use as best citations, cite your research, cite your knowledge, but make it so the public can understand what you're saying. I think hopefully that'll go a long way in future pandemics. Hopefully there aren't future pandemics, but we know there will be. So, yeah.
You were discussing previous pandemics and epidemics and things of that sort. Thinking back to the 2014-2015 Ebola outbreak that we had, there was this big to-do about disaster preparedness and putting all of these different checkpoints in place to make sure that when the next pandemic came, we would be prepared and able to respond quickly and stuff like that. And I know over time, the money and the funding for that kind of dried up because it wasn't, at the forefront anymore. We weren't afraid of it because it wasn't there. And then we get to, 2019 when we have this pandemic come up again, and it was kind of like we don't have enough PPE and we're running around trying to get stuff. And so, talking about growth and learning from mistakes, do you think that this pandemic has convinced, the powers that be, disaster preparedness needs to be important and it needs to be at the forefront, and we do need to make sure that we keep those resources available in case something happens?
Yeah. I sure hope so. And every few years we have a new epidemic of some sort. I mean, between Ebola, which I think that's the one that strikes the most fear into our hearts, right? And I think half the world has forgotten that it even exists, even though there's ongoing outbreaks now. But you're absolutely right. I think we say that we're going to be preventative, and there's so many programs out there to prevent, preempt, all these terms, and then it gets here, and we don't even have enough toilet paper, not to mention masks. So I really hope that, if nothing else, SARS-CoV-2 has shown us that there are steps that we have to be able to take immediately, pivoting hospitals so that they can have higher capacity, making sure people can protect themselves. I mean, realistically, everybody should have N95 masks at this point, so why that's not something that we can even easily get for the general public is beyond me. Not that people will wear them because they're horribly uncomfortable, but there's ways that we can make this better. So I really hope, and that's partly what I think what it's going to be is people like you. When people forget about SARS-CoV-2 in 10 years, I think we have to have people on the scientific side of the world saying this is not going to go away, and the things that helped have to be available to help right at the get-go. Funding makes it incredibly difficult, as everybody here knows. And stockpiling is tricky because so many things expire or there's no place for them. But I do think that we have to have a better plan in response immediately than what we've done in the past. There are a lot of steps we could have taken differently that may have changed the initial impact of SARS-CoV-2 that we just weren't ready for it. So hopefully this is a lesson learned, I really hope. Yeah.
So at the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about West Nile virus, the epidemic of that, and how it's a success story in animals. But there was a discrepancy where recently we had our highest case of human West Nile virus. And I was wondering if you could talk about your thoughts on why there is that discrepancy.
Yeah, so the question, if you couldn't hear, is why was there that discrepancy with West Nile where we had success with animals but not with people? In my opinion, that was largely due to vaccine technology. And it is kind of amazing to me how much more willing people are to vaccinate their children and their pets than they are themselves. So there's never been a really good reason for any company to produce a human West Nile vaccine in terms of economic benefit. People largely don't see it as a huge threat, even though we know it's a big deal. 2,100 cases when you're facing 5.5 million COVID deaths seems like a drop in the bucket. But for those who have been impacted, it's a much bigger deal than that. So I think not having a strong backing from people and public health officials and society as a whole to say we need this vaccine, we need this for humans, limits us in our ability to respond to a disease like West Nile that isn't nearly as catastrophic as COVID, but is still causing a lot of problems. But again, those of you who have pets here, and if somebody says you get your dog a rabies vaccine, you usually don't even think twice, oh yeah, that's what we do, it's just what we do. But when you tell somebody that they need to get their own vaccine, it's a whole different ballgame. For better or for worse, I wish we could get people to be as good about helping themselves as they are about helping their animals. But hopefully, again, these are things that can change. It's a great question, though. Very frustrating for anybody who works with West Nile, but hopefully it'll get better. All right. Thank you guys for some great questions. I'll hang around afterwards if anybody has anything they didn't want to ask in front of the group, and I cannot wait to see all the talks and posters today. So thanks again.
Okay, just a couple housekeeping items here. First, Dr. Bosco-Lauth, thank you so much for that enlightened and optimistic historical perspective, and great, all of you, for your attendance. And obviously, we have a lot more going on today, so I just wanted to kind of review. The oral sessions are upstairs. They start at noon, which is I think about 10 minutes away. So do the refreshments. They'll last as long as they last. I think they're up in the poster room, which is ballroom AB, the first one, the one that you'll see when you go upstairs. Oral session 1 is basic translational, and this is in the program, but just in case you don't have it, that's 308-310, the corridor upstairs that kind of runs along this southern perspective. The oral session 2 is just next to it in LSC 4, and then the third session, clinical science, is in 302. If you want to go to session 3 is in 302. Oral session 4 is in clinical translational sciences in 300, which is kind of around a corner. So if you're headed in that corridor, you'll find that it ends at 302, and you have to kind of jog right and around again to find room 300, which is about as far south as you can get in the building, at least on that floor. Judges, if you're judging, please remember, if you're using the actual hard sheets, to get those turned in as soon as possible so we can have everything tabulated in time for the award ceremony at 4, or at least at 5. We'll start the hors d'oeuvres at 4. And if possible, you can scan the QR code if you're a judge with your phone and actually do it that way, and it'll immediately get tabulated. So everybody else who's attending, if you can stick around till 4 o'clock in ballroom CD, that's when the hors d'oeuvres start, and we'll have a social hour until 5 when all the awards will be given out for the presenters and the Golden Pet Award. That's all I've got, so thanks again for your participation and attendance, and we'll see you all hopefully throughout the day. Thanks very much.